Hey Josh.
Hey, Dorian.
Hey, so welcome to Blogging Heads, and I'm Dorian Warren, and we have Josh Eidelson with us, labor reporter for various magazines in these times, The Atlantic, not The Atlantic, The American Prospect, The Nation. Am I missing something?
I'm a contributing writer at Salon and In These Times, and then freelance at various places where I get to talk about labor.
Great. So you probably are one of, say, two or three labor reporters in the country that has a very broad view of the landscape of what's happening to the labor movement right now and in the last year. Can you give us a sense of what do the attacks on labor look like and where are they happening in this country? From the
Sure.
Midwest to the South, give us a sense of what you've been seeing over the last few months.
So, legislatively, there was this tremendous opportunity opened up for the right in the elections, particularly at the statewide level in 2010. Whereas there are attacks in Congress, there's still a Democratic Senate and a president that will veto some stuff. On the statewide level, Republicans grabbed a bunch of state legislatures. Two of your Roosevelt colleagues just wrote a great piece pointing out what that's meant in terms of public sector layoffs. But it's also meant that many states, there's really a magic moment for conservatives to be able to take a head-on attack on the labor movement. And that takes the form of so-called right-to-work laws. It takes the form of laws to make it more difficult for unions to collect dues or participate in politics. There are places like South Carolina where Nikki Haley wants to keep her right-wing credentials in place, but it's already an incredibly anti-union legal environment, and so she's stuck saying we're going to make a law that reiterates the fact that we're a right-to-work state. And maybe most creatively, in Georgia, we saw what I think we can call real overreach. It's very easy for opponents to say when something happens that they don't like, well, it's overreach and they're going to pay for it. In the case of Georgia, we know the Republicans overreached because they actually had the Tea Party come out opposing them, and they, in the end, had to drop their anti-union bill. In part, I would say, because they gave away the game, that it actually was an attack on democratic rights. Whereas many of these other places, we see an attack on people's right to associate, right to assemble, to collectively bargain, but it doesn't get talked about, and you've written about this. It doesn't get talked about in terms of democracy. It gets talked about in terms of shared sacrifice and balancing the budget and dealing with the crisis.
So there are a couple things here. One is you wrote a very interesting article arguing that there is this strange alliance between the Tea Party and labor in Georgia. You mentioned that in Georgia they overreach. So can you talk about that for a bit?
Sure. So, as I said, Republicans have to strain some places where there is low union density and a really anti-union set of laws on the books already, along with our not very good federal labor law. They have to strain to come up with creative ways to union bust in the legislature. So in Georgia, they had what was called an anti-picketing bill, which was a response in part to a labor Occupy action that targeted AT&T over layoffs in Atlanta. So this bill said you can't picket at someone's house if it could disturb someone's quiet enjoyment. Now, for those of us who think we live under First Amendment, where freedom of speech is a fundamental right in the U.S., the idea that the law could enshrine quiet enjoyment as a fundamental right in a state that could get someone locked up for picketing is disturbing. It also made it easier to go to a judge and get an injunction to stop somebody from protesting. And this law, because it was so baldly coming out and taking away people's right to protest, to go up against big business or small business when they disagree and make the fight personal, because of that, it actually engendered the opposition of the Atlanta Tea Party, as well as an anti-abortion group and other conservatives who said, you know what, this actually could affect us. We at least believe that we should have the right to protest. And there's a real irony here. So I talked to Debbie Dooley, who is one of the original national Tea Party leaders, runs the Atlanta Tea Party, and she said, I support fighting against this bill because if I have the right or anybody else has the right to picket, so should a union. And philosophically, I agree with her, and it's to her credit that she took that stance and she opposed a bill that had a bunch of other anti-union provisions over that. But the irony is unions already don't have the same right to picket that other people do.
Right.
Under
Right.
federal law, unions don't
Right.
have that right.
Yeah, the First Amendment doesn't apply to lots of different kinds of union activity, including, for instance, secondary boycotts or secondary strikes, where it's illegal to. This was imposed by Taft-Hartley in 1947 as a backlash to the rights that workers won through the Wagner Act in 35. And essentially, if you're in a unionized workplace and you're on strike against your employer, say you're on strike against, a supermarket store, and it sells apples. There's a famous Supreme Court case on this. It sells apples. You cannot then encourage the workers at the apple picking place to go on strike because of your dispute. That's illegal, and that's considered secondary activity. So there is no. There are a number of limits, at least, on First Amendment rights of the unions under labor law to picket, depending on the nature of the conflict, which other nonprofit groups in this country don't have in terms of those same limits.
Exactly.
So that's Georgia. Tell us a little bit about Indiana, because you make an argument about the way in which the labor movement frames fights around right to work. So can you tease that out a bit for us in terms of what happened in Indiana and what your argument is?
So Indiana is a less optimistic example. I mean, in Indiana, for years, Governor Mitch Daniels, a man that a lot of left-of-center pundits on TV talk about as one of the reasonable Republicans. Mitch Daniels, after holding off in the past and horse trading not to do it, in his last year in office, got behind a so-called right-to-work bill, and it passed through the Indiana legislature. They're somewhat like Wisconsin. Legislators left and denied a quorum and slowed the bill that way. Mm-hmm. But unlike Wisconsin, the Indiana legislators made a choice to come back. The Democrats came back and let the law pass. And so what I was reacting to in this piece was some of the language. And labor, admittedly, is in a difficult position on right to work because right to work is appealing language. Mm-hmm. These are issues that aren't well understood or explained in the media. But there's a real danger in the way that unions and their defenders sometimes respond. So what a right to work law does is it's the government outlawing contracts between unions and companies that include a clause that says, in order to work here, while being represented by the union, you can be compelled to pay for the cost of the representation. No one can be compelled to pay full union dues, but if you're not in a right-to-work state and you're represented by a union, which anywhere in the country has a responsibility legally to represent you, in a not right-to-work state, you can be made to pay the cost of the representation. Mm-hmm. Now, in a right-to-work state, and Indiana just became the 23rd, unions are effectively semi-defunded because nobody has to pay any cost for representation. So, in fighting back against this, some of the Democrats that support labor in the legislature, some people in the labor movement, make these arguments where they compare a union to a business. And in the Indiana legislature, it was compared to a sports agent. It was compared to other kinds of companies that you might hire to represent you. And people said, look, if you're an insurance agent, you need to pay them for representation. Why shouldn't it be the same for a union? Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that I squirm when I hear that is I was a union organizer. I was a union organizer for 5 years with Unite Here. Mm-hmm. And when I would be in the break room, when I would be pushing workers who had a union to get involved, to step up, I would hear the same kind of language from them. I would hear, I'm already paying dues, you're like my lawyer, you're like my insurance agent, I hire you to fight for me, go fight for me. And those conversations, sometimes we moved past that, and there are people with whom I didn't. But the problem is that the union movement doesn't have leverage that way. If unions act like service agents, where you send someone a check and then they fight for you, it's a false promise at best. It's really a recipe for extinction at worst. And that's what I argued in the Salon article. Is
So
given
yeah.
the terrible legal environment, which you've written extensively about, if a union acts like a business where you pay and then a paid staff person goes and makes a legal argument for you, it's only going to last as long as the company chooses to let it last.
So let me pose two alternatives to you and see what you think. So one alternative would be to, on some level, agree with right-wing, right-to-work zealots who are pushing through these laws in, Indiana, as you said, it's a 23rd state. I mean, one could make the argument that being a union in a right-to-work state forces you to develop a different kind of union model, one in which you actually work very hard to empower and educate the members to take action and to pay dues voluntarily. So in lots of right-to-work states and lots of places in the South where there aren't union security clauses where membership dues are automatically deducted from an employee's paycheck, those unions that do have a tiny bit of presence in those states have been forced to build a different kind of union model where leadership development among members is paramount, because you have to provide a different kind of incentive for them to get involved. So maybe what you're suggesting, or one way to interpret what you're saying is right-to-work states could be good in the sense of rebuilding a different kind of labor movement where union leaders aren't, complacent, let's say, in terms of knowing that their treasuries will be replenished every month when automatic dues checkoff comes in, but instead they have to work harder to build strong membership organizations where workers feel like they want to pay dues. So what's to say, talk about strange alliances, how would you respond to that kind of argument?
So I think it's an interesting argument, and there are situations where unions are not fighting, are not engaging members, and need some kind of push. Now, there are better ways for that to happen than a right-to-work law, but there are certainly cases where unions will do what they should have been doing anyway in response to that kind of electric shock that otherwise might not. The reason I don't support right-to-work laws, though, is in terms of what the baseline is, what the default is. The baseline shouldn't be that individuals come in and if you choose to pay union dues, you're then paying for everybody else's representation and other people aren't. I mean, the end result, when you get to the end goal, to the kind of fighting union that can survive, that isn't just depending on an employer to get to have some kind of clout, it shouldn't matter. So in Unite Here, the largest local is in Nevada, which is right to work.
Right.
Well over 90% of members there pay dues, because if you feel like you're part of a movement, if you feel some kind of ownership over the union, then of course you're going to pay dues. But you're not just going to pay dues. You're going to spend hours and hours outside of work without getting paid for it, organizing and contributing your time and risking your job in order to build the union. So the real question is, how do we get there? And if I thought that right-to-work laws would lead unions to get there more quickly, then there would be a good case for them. I don't think that's the way to get there. And in terms of, building that kind of union takes good organizing. It takes time, right? It takes a spirit of struggle. And defunding unions from going from a default where people contribute something monetarily to a default where they don't, I think often it doesn't spur the union to organize better. It creates a situation where the first thing that you're asking union members to do is go out and convince other people why they should be paying for a union so that they can try to build something that's going to fight in the future. I think letting unions and companies negotiate a clause that says for the narrow cost of representation, as long as you're represented, you're going to pay for it, it's more fair, right? It's certainly not something that the government should be doing to intervene and say, no, unions have to represent people for free. And it means that there are more resources for organizing. But if you don't use those organizing resources to build a movement where people feel a sense of ownership and where the question of whether you would pay dues isn't the question. The question is, how many nights a week are you going to spend driving around organizing other workers? If you're not building that, then you're vulnerable not just to right to work, but to lockouts, to the company coming after you in any number of ways because you don't really have worker leverage to defend yourself.
Right. So let me ask you to respond to a different thought that comes from your discussion about the arguments used around right to work. So a different frame that the labor movement could use would be to think of unions as government. They're kind of mini governments inside the workplace, and like any other government that provides a public good that from which everyone benefits, you're taxed. So ultimately, what union dues are, we could think of it like this: what union dues are, they're a tiny tax for the public good that the union contract provides inside this now democratically governed workplace. So respond to that frame, that metaphor of unionized firms as governments, workplaces with governments through which the workers are in some way citizens who are then taxed for the public good that the union provides.
Well, so, I mean, as you've written about at Salon also, right, workplaces should be democratic. They're not democratic. And so I think what I like about that analogy is that it talks about an idea of citizenship at work and democracy at work, and the idea that you should have citizenship rights that come with you onto the job, and that there should be regulation on the job that isn't at the discretion or based on the generosity of management, but comes from the majority of the people there who aren't managers. I think the downside is if we're talking about it in a way that reinforces the idea of somebody else representing you. That, you elect a senator, and in some distant way, that senator is supposed to act on your behalf. If people think about representation in the workplace that way, then again, it lends itself to this idea of I'm paying somebody else to represent me. So I think there's a pro and a con there. I mean, ultimately, though, I think the only way people are going to be excited and happy about paying dues is going to come not from some kind of analogy about how it compares to other ways they spend money. It's going to come from an excitement about being part of a movement. And that also comes from anger, right? If people are furious enough at their boss and they feel like being part of a union is part of a way of getting control over their workplace and fighting back against their boss, then the expenses that dues pay for are generally going to make sense. And if there are ones that aren't going to make sense, even to workers who are angry and furious and inspired, then they may not be good expenses. And then things are going to need to move in terms of spending money in a way that can be justified to workers who are engaged in the union.
Yeah, to anger, I think I'd also add hope, because I think anger is a motivator for lots of people, it's the spark to action, but I think people also need a hopeful vision that things could be different and that their action could lead to better conditions in some future date. But for them taking action and having a sense of hopefulness as well as indignation at the conditions, that they could actually change things and successfully, that would minimize the anger, but also realize this hopeful vision of a more just and fair and democratic workplace.
Oh, I totally agree.
Yeah, let's shift gears a little bit, and although it's still related, can I ask you to talk a little bit about, because I want to get to national labor politics. Are these attacks at the state level from Georgia to Indiana to Wisconsin to Michigan to Ohio, are these
to New Hampshire and
coordinated?
Maine?
Yes, exactly. Are these coordinated attacks? And if so, why now? Why not 5 years ago or even 10 years ago? Why do we see this wave of activity at this historical moment?
So I think there is a clear level of coordination, and you look at the work of a group like ALEC, the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council that writes some of this legislation that brings people together. There's totally coordination. There also are just shared interests, that the interests of a Republican governor in one state with a Republican legislature often look the same as in another state. I think it's a combination of urgency and opportunity. And so there's, as you've written about, unions, as weak as they've become in many ways, are still one of the strongest bulwarks against corporations in American politics. They have a lot of members. They spend, compared to, a group like the Sierra Club, they spend a lot of money on politics. And so there's an immediate motivation for right-wing politicians to get them out. And the argument goes both ways, right? On the one hand, you can say, well, Republicans go after unions because they support Democrats. On the other hand, you can say Republicans go after Democrats because they want policies that are going to be even worse for unions.
Right.
Or that the politicians that support Republicans want that. I think in terms of why now, part of it, as you've written, is that we're at a point where for the first time the majority of union members are in the public sector.
Yes.
And the kinds of attacks that have weakened the labor movement elsewhere, it's logical that the people who want to hamstring labor are going to go after the public sector. I think also, though, the failure of many unions to effectively organize in the private sector opens people up for resentment.
Right.
So in Wisconsin, there was a New York Times article talking about Scott Walker's attack on collective bargaining, where someone was interviewed saying, yeah, I support Scott Walker because I don't get to bargain at my job. And I think that tells us a lot about the traction. It's not just that right-wingers have a lot of money to spend on these things. It's also that there is a real vein of resentment. There's a real vein of class resentment in the U.S., and conservatives have done a more effective job of appealing to it. And one of the targets, when most people are not in a union, they've been somewhat effective in convincing people to turn that resentment on union members who have middle-class benefits and have them paid for by taxpayers.
So this is interesting because this is related to what we were just talking about. Because it's why wouldn't workers not in unions, for all their resentment of, say, public sector workers, why wouldn't they then aspire to have the same kinds of workplace conditions instead of bringing people down to their level? And they can't be happy at the workplace. Or maybe people are, I doubt it. So why not a hopeful, we want what those men and women have too? And instead what we see and what it's been almost everywhere what we see is the resentment winning the argument around, not only do I not have that in my workplace, but my tax-paying dollars are paying for them to have those cushy pensions. Why wouldn't people aspire? Why wouldn't we all aspire to have a cushy pension? This is a question that I simply can't. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people do. A lot of people do, right? I mean, the electoral base for Republicans is still rich people more than poor people. At the same time, I think it's significant that Republicans do populism more effectively than Democrats do. So, I mean, the Wisconsin recalls last year, the Senate recalls, were unusual for even the limited degree of populism that we did see from Democratic candidates. And, of course, Republicans came back and said, oh, well, you know, the person who was in this ad was the daughter of a union boss. And for a long time on economic issues, right, we've seen Republicans hold out people who are in the middle class as the enemy. And I think partly it has to do with a sense of possibility, right? Like, why in education do we see so much energy devoted towards the idea of cutting benefits or cutting protections for teachers rather than increasing spending? I think partly it has to do with a sense of what's possible. There's a sense that you could go into the political arena and out-wrestle a bus driver or a teacher, but you're not going to be able to out-wrestle a big bank or a millionaire. And I think that journalism plays a role, I think politicians play a role in this, and I think the failure to have a real class-based populist platform from a lot of left-of-center politicians all play a role in the sense that you are locked in a struggle with middle-class people, and rich people basically are intractable in terms of their benefits.
I want to pick up on another theme in your writing and in my writing as well, and this is debates about the role of law to organizing and to the strength or weakness of the labor movement. And so I've written about the failure of labor law reform in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and in the context of almost 50 years of failure to reform labor law to favor unions. And so one of the critiques that a lot of us offer, not just me, but you and some others, you know, a lot of us say, well, look, the law isn't the magic bullet. Changing the law to make it more union friendly, whether legislative change from Congress or rule changes from the National Labor Relations Board or the National Mediation Board, any of those things, they might help at the margins, but that's not going to be, legal change is not going to be what's going to revive the labor movement. So that's, I think, in some ways, that for those of us that are pro-union, that's almost a consensus on our side. On the other hand, it makes you wonder when you look out at the Republican and the right-wing attacks on labor through legislation. It seems to me they actually do have a vision around the role of law and the weakening of labor. And it seems to be both a stronger vision and a more successful vision. Obviously, they have more power than labor does, but they have a vision that seems much more, that links the strength of labor to the law much more tightly than maybe many of us who are critics of labor strategy link the role of the law in organizing. So I'm wondering what you think of that, the way I just framed that in terms of, does the right have it right, and do we as critics have it wrong at some level?
So, I think you're right that Republicans certainly see a lot of advantage in these legislative attacks on unions. To some extent, I think they also set a trap, though, in that the more that unions are put in a corner of defending themselves, as we see, for example, on this website that Daryl Issa just launched today, attacking unions for spending money on politics. The framing there very much is, well, what is your union doing for you? What are your representatives doing for you? How are they justifying taking your money? And so I think at the same time that Republicans legislatively attack unions, they can also set traps for unions to defend themselves in this servicing model, to say, oh, well, look, this is what we did for you. Or to say to the public, oh, look, we sponsored this piece of the highway, or, we donated to hurricane relief. And that's what we're doing, rather than justifying themselves as social movements. I think also it is complicated. And so I'm writing now, I have a piece that'll come out in these times about this question of, well, would unions be better off without labor law? And I think one of the angles to think about there is the symbolic power of the law also. So when I was an organizer, it was significant for people, the idea that companies would be breaking the law if they did this or that to them, if they retaliated. And I was always ambivalent about that, because you don't want to set up this false hope. You don't want people to think that the law is what's going to protect them. But it does still mean something to know this is illegal or it's not. I think also it just, when you defund unions, or when you make people think that they're never going to be recognized by a company, and the company or the government has no responsibility even on paper to recognize them, it discourages people. It does take away some of that hope. And I think that there is a real tension there, as you were talking about hope, in this question of, well, how much should unions emphasize the legal protections that are there and the intention of the law to promote collective bargaining, and how much should they be out talking about how broken it is and how reliant workers are going to have to be on each other. But I think, I talked to Tom Gagan recently, the attorney, and he said, I used to make this argument all the time about being better off without the law, but labor is always regulated. He said it's regulated to the advantage of workers, or it's regulated to the advantage of employers. And so the law, I think, is always going to be a place where that is contested. And it is, when you have power, it is a way that you secure that power, right? You fight it out, and then you try to secure something so that you won't have to keep fighting it out all the time. And I think we've seen to a large extent that when you stop fighting, you lose whatever you think that you secured. But if conservatives were successful in ending any kind of dues deduction and ending collective bargaining for public workers, I don't think that would help the revival of the labor movement. But at the same time, I don't think that beating back those attacks in and of itself would make a kind of unionism sustainable that doesn't engage workers and doesn't engage communities and doesn't build power.
Okay,
what's your sense of it?
Well, I'm wondering if, and we don't have, we won't have data for a while, but I'm wondering if there isn't something to be said for, say, the rule changes at the National Labor Relations Board, which went into effect this year, essentially, that closes the gap between when workers file a petition asking for a union election and when the election's actually held. Usually in between that time, employers constantly use a range of delaying tactics, because the longer they can stretch out an election campaign, the more likely they are to campaign against the union using a range of intimidating tactics, and then the more likely they are to win that election versus the workers. So I'm wondering if, that simple but, say, minor rule change the board issued, making elections happen faster, wouldn't make a difference if more unions then went to the NLRB and filed for elections as opposed to other strategies. And the same could be asked of the National Mediation Board. Do we know? So there's a rule change there under the Obama National Mediation Board. And for those that don't know, as Josh writes, the National Mediation Board was set up under the Railway Labor Act, which regulates most transportation and airline workers, separate from the National Labor Relations Act. So flight attendants and pilots and ground crews at airports are all covered by that piece of legislation and by the National Mediation Board. They changed the rule under the Obama-appointed board, which meant that in union elections, instead of the old rule where you needed a majority of all those in the bargaining unit to win, you only need a majority of those voting to win, which is how our political elections are run. So it seems to me, and as Josh points out, both President Obama and the Democrats in Congress signed off on a Republican rider to the FAA Reauthorization Act, which makes it so that workers need at least a majority to even petition for an election under the National Mediation Board. So they're trying to continue to raise the bar to make it harder to unionize. But nonetheless, those two rule changes, so quicker elections under the National Labor Relations Act that the NLRB oversees, and then just a majority of those voting in the case of National Mediation Board elections, don't those essentially legal changes make it slightly easier for unions to organize if they were up to the challenge of even taking advantage of those rule changes?
So I think, as you say with the FAA bill, there's a good case to be made that workers are actually worse off than they were before because of the changes that were in the law, which I've written about in Salon, and especially when there are Republicans on the National Mediation Board, they could reverse that change, but the change for the worse that's actually in the law will stay in place. But setting that aside, in terms of this question, I think there's the potential for it to make a difference on the margins and for those unions that still are using NLRB elections, like the Teamsters. I don't think, and talking to folks at the AFL-CIO, they don't really think either that the unions that have abandoned the NLRB process are going to come back to it over the shortening of the election period. I was on a conference call that an anti-union law firm had. I reported on it for Endless Times, where they talked about, well, with this shortened election period, what you need to do is buy 5 captive audience meetings from us, our package where in the few weeks before the election happens, we will give you the script and tell you, as union-busting managers, how to have 5 mandatory on-the-clock meetings to discourage unionization. There's also research that Kate Bronfenbrenner has done that shows that many of the violations of labor law that happen in a union campaign happen before that clock has even started, before the union has even asked for an election. And that's because companies generally know when people are organizing. They generally know a long time before they go for an election. And even if workers win the election, companies can try to get the ballots impounded, they can delay. And as you've mentioned in your writing, half the time within a year, even if they win the election, they don't have a contract because the law doesn't really require employers to make meaningful concessions in negotiations. So I think the challenge that determines whether you have a union, with the exception of if a company decides it wants a union because of keeping out another union or political help or something, if the company doesn't want a union, the challenge becomes about breaking the company's will to crush that union. And the NLRB process doesn't do that. And that's why, whether it's through getting an outside agreement, pressuring the company to agree to a different process, or if it happens in a contract campaign or later on in a lockout, you have to have some kind of leverage, whether it comes from workers marching on the boss, from going on strike, from getting politicians involved, from getting other companies in the supply chain involved, from going to customers, or else if you're stuck relying on the law, there's a high likelihood that you're not going to get that contract for a long time. So I think anything that reduces the period of time to bust the union and terrorize people is potentially helpful. And as you say, it'll be interesting to see the data, but it's hard to see how it would be a game changer.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I honestly go back and forth about this myself because sometimes I'll read something and that'll suggest that the growth of the cause of the growth of the labor movement, say in the 30s, and this is a debate that happened in the 80s among some political scientists, that the cause was actually that workers, without the law on their side, were militant and engaged in wildcat strikes and a range of other kinds of workplace collective actions. And that was what got the law passed in the first place. So, there were wildcat strikes in 1934, for instance, which were on the minds of legislators in Congress as they were debating the Wagner Act in late 1934, early 1935. And that it was worker activity and militant worker activity on the one hand that got the law passed in the first place, but that workers were already in motion, they were already organizing, they were already winning. You can make the same argument with public sector workers. The teachers union was founded in the early 1900s, long before public sector workers had collective bargaining rights. So there were a range of efforts to be a union long before the law was on the side of workers. On the other hand, you might argue, well, that's great. Those are some good examples. But overall, it wasn't until not only the passage of the Wagner Act in 35, but not until the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional in 37, that you really start to see the upsurge and increase in union membership and union density in the late 30s. And then throughout World War II, and we can debate the role of the war as well in fostering unionization. But nonetheless, the argument is that it's the law. Once the law was on the side of workers, and again, you can make the same argument with the public sector, it radically increased the numbers of union members and the ability of workers to take the risk to organize once they understood that the law was on their side. So what's your take on this debate? I mean, today I'm feeling as though the law doesn't matter, that workers could engage in collective action. They did for 150, 200 years before they ever had the real rights to organize. They engaged in strikes all the time. And we don't see that kind of strike activity today. You'd be hard-pressed to see any group of workers go out on strike, even though the law is technically on their side. So today I'm feeling a little, like the law doesn't matter as much as we might think it does. But tomorrow, who knows how I'll feel. How do you feel about this debate? What's the role of the law?
I mean, I think I share some of that ambivalence. I was just writing about Michigan, where the governor, Rick Snyder, signed a specific law saying graduate student research assistants aren't workers and the state labor board can't give them union recognition. So the workers there are responding by filing a legal challenge, trying to get a constitutional amendment supporting collective bargaining. So I asked them, well, the University of Michigan in this case has said that it supports you, that you should have the legal right to collective bargaining with them. So why do you need the law? If you have a company that is claiming to support you or your bargaining rights, just go back to the University of Michigan and demand that they bargain and negotiate with you. Why not? And the response from their attorney was basically, that would be a pretty precarious recognition. We wouldn't have recourse to labor law, and we don't think the law stands, so we're going to fight it. And I think it cuts both ways, right? No, it means something culturally. It also means something substantively when coming after you and firing you is illegal. And the idea, I mean, it was interesting the other day, Herman Cain said, well, my workers have the right to organize, but if they do, I have the right to fire all of them. And there was a certain amount of, Herman Cain doesn't know the law. But it also reveals, I mean, this is someone who ran a business for a long time. It says something about how weak labor law is also.
Right.
But at the same time, if a sign went up in a workplace tomorrow that said the company legally can fire you if you organize, I don't think that would, in and of itself, lead to a great upsurge in organizing, right? It could really contribute to a death spiral.
By the way, you just mentioned about the state of Michigan, and I got an email earlier today from a colleague who's in labor studies at the University of Illinois, an old friend from Chicago, who wrote me to say that there's pending legislation in the state of Michigan that would ban university faculty and employees from working with worker centers. So the idea is to attack essentially labor studies programs at state universities. So let me read the language here. It's the intent of the legislature that a public university that receives funds in Section 236 shall not collaborate in any matter with a nonprofit worker center whose documented activities include coercion through protest, demonstration, or organization against the Michigan business. I mean, that's quite a stunning attack on First Amendment rights, much less on labor and on workers' rights to organization, whether or not it results in a collective bargaining agreement or not. It's quite stunning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to the success of worker centers, right? Every time unions come up, or I should say the broader labor movement comes up with something effective, there's a legal challenge, right? Unions try to coerce companies, so to speak, by using public pressure, going after their brand, and then racketeering legislation gets used to file lawsuits to say it should be illegal for you to publicly embarrass us. So absolutely, it shows people on the right are pulling out all the stops all over the place. But I think it also goes to what's thought of as political. Mm-hmm. And this is something that, again, sort of the cultural impact of these laws on things like secondary boycotts, that when it becomes legally restricted for unions to say, no one should buy from you because you're buying from a company we're on strike with, it contributes to this sense that broader consumer decisions aren't political, that lots of consumer transactions aren't political. And this worker center bill you're talking about is interesting to hear about because all the time businesses take interns, right? Businesses, I dealt as an organizer with people who were doing HR, who were firing workers and getting school credit for it. Right. So I think it speaks to the way that when workers fight back, it's seen as political, it's seen as class warfare, and management prerogatives aren't seen as political in the same way.
So we're running out of time here. Is there a topic or an issue you want to raise to discuss in the last few minutes we have left?
So in your Salon piece, you talk about labor as a democratic movement, and you very well make the point that the kind of tyranny that we reject in the rest of our life, we shouldn't accept from the boss on the job. And you and I share the sense, we've both written about it, that the labor movement is and should be and should act like a movement for democracy and should get seen that way. So I wonder your thoughts about what do we do with that intuition? What do we do with that sense? I mean, how would unions act differently? How would people participate differently in our politics if labor was recognized as a movement for democracy and not just a movement for higher wages or protection from getting fired?
It's astounding to me how arguments, especially on the right, about freedom and the lack of government and the desire for the lack of government in people's lives, which is, I mean, we can debate that government's in every aspect of our life, and it's a good thing. But for most part, except for when government decides to make choices about, what women can do with their bodies, that's another story. But people who proclaim to not want government involvement in their lives and who think that somehow that's a form of tyranny are perfectly willing to walk into work every day and have a private actor with total control over their lives. Because essentially, under our legal regime that governs the workplace, with few exceptions, employers are mini dictators. We have to do whatever our employer says, otherwise they can fire us, again, with few exceptions. So I think for what labor could do, and it would mean at least two things. One would be a long-term campaign to reframe how we think of ourselves as citizens in the society, in the polity, and in the workplace. And that's part of what I mean by arguing for workplace democracy. If we accept certain political principles and freedoms in the broader society, why would we then check those at the workplace door every single day? Why would I want to go into a place where I can't even determine when I can go to the bathroom? That's not freedom. by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, that's a form of tyranny and domination of a more powerful person over someone with less power. So I think there's a long-term campaign here to reframe how people should even think about their rights at the workplace, how we should think about the role of unions in advancing workplace democracy and saying, no, you should have as much freedom at the workplace than similar to how much freedom you arguably that we aspects of our lives. So that's one, so it's a reframing, it's a long-term way to think about our fundamental relationship between our citizenship and our identities and work. On the other hand, I think the argument that we should have workplace democracy puts unions in a place to have a strong and central role in our broader society. So we know that unions advance democracy in the political sphere. Unions turn out low-income voters. They turn out people that aren't as likely to vote. They play a significant role in advancing citizenship across the country. But I think we should also come to see unions as advancing citizenship at the workplace, and that they have a central and a permanent role in making sure democracy is a core aspect of every breathing moment that we have, not just at home, not just when we go to a political meeting, but also where we spend the most amount of our time, and that's at the workplace. So there's two elements here. On the one hand, this notion that we should rethink how we view ourselves in relationship to work, but then second, we should be rethinking how we view unions, and we should be seeing unions as central to maintaining a standard of democracy and citizenship at work. And for the most part, that hasn't been the argument of the labor movement. I mean, the closest we got to that was the AFL-CIO's Voice at Work campaign in the late 90s and throughout the first decade of the 2000s, which sounds great. And of course, voice of any kind is an essential part of democracy. But I think there could be a stronger argument made for fundamental workplace democracy based on the principles of citizenship that we would accept in any other sphere of life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's this sort of cultural acceptance of the idea that you cordon off your work life from the rest of your life. It isn't true of anybody's experience at work, right? Work is the main thing that people do when they're not asleep. And I mean, I wrote about a pair of sisters at a hotel where workers are trying to join Unite Here, the union I used to work for, who were fired after one of them complained because the company said, we're going to appreciate the housekeepers. And they did it by having photos of people in swimsuits. And they took workers' faces and put them on top and put it on a bulletin board. Wow. So this is how they were going to supposedly appreciate housekeepers. Wow. And you could say the company, was exercising its discretion, its infinite tyrannical discretion over workers. Or you could say they thought it was funny and they didn't talk to any housekeepers about it. And more likely, they thought it was cute. And we know they didn't talk to any housekeepers about it. One of the workers spoke up, and then they got fired. Now, the company says that's not why they were. The workers say it is. But it really speaks to what it means to have a dictatorship at work, to go home and know that you're, as one of the workers said to me, I'm a large woman, you're put on a swimsuit model's body, and you take that home with you, and that isn't something that ends when you punch out. And it is something that de facto our legal system, our culture accepts right now in the U.S. that kind of thing, that being fired for going to the bathroom or coming into work and having your face put on somebody else's body for everybody to look at it is the price you pay for having a job. And as you say, it's quite, as much as it's commonly accepted, it's quite an extreme thing that we've come to accept. And being seen as the opponent of that, being seen as the movement where democracy is about control in all the parts of your life is part of what is going to make a change, right? Is connected to that question of what's the future for the labor movement.
Well, on that note, I think we have run out of time, but thanks, Josh, for having this conversation with me. There's so much that we didn't cover that I hope we can do this again to delve in more deeply to some of these issues around the labor movement, around the law, around the right-wing attack on labor. So thanks for engaging in this first of hopefully many dialogues with me here on
Let's do it. Thank you so much.